The first thing I knew was pain. Not the clean, sharp kind that announces itself and moves on. This was the other kind, the kind that had already unpacked its bags and settled in for a long stay. It lived in my jaw, my ribs, the deep architecture of my spine. It whispered in the marrow of my femur and screamed from the split skin above my left temple. My body felt like something that had been used violently and then discarded, which I supposed was exactly what it was. The second thing I knew was warmth. That confused me more than the pain did. I was lying on something soft, obscenely, impossibly soft, after months of sleeping on a thin pallet in the lowest sublevel of the Ironvale Pack compound. Furs, thick and dark, were tangled around my legs. Beneath me, something yielded instead of pressing back. A real mattress. An actual bed. And the scent saturating everything, soaked into the fabric, rising from the walls, hanging in the warm air like incense, was not mine. Pine resin and dark earth and something storm-charged that prickled at the edges of my awareness. Something that made the battered, half-conscious thing inside me sit up straighter despite the pain. Something old, something enormous. Alpha. The recognition detonated through my nervous system before I could stop it. Not just alpha. Something categorically beyond that. Something that made every alpha I'd ever encountered feel like a lit match held against this. Whatever this was. A wildfire. A lightning strike. The thing that came before names were invented for it. I forced my eyes open. The room assembled itself in pieces. High stone ceiling, rough-hewn and ancient, with iron candelabras dripping cold wax. A fireplace broad enough to park a horse in, flames low and amber, throwing shifting shadows up walls hung with dark tapestries depicting wolves mid-hunt against a blood moon backdrop. Heavy furniture, a writing table, 2 chairs, a wardrobe carved from some black wood I didn't recognize. All oversized, built for someone who needed the extra space. And blood, dried, rust brown, flaking at the edges. On my forearm where they'd gripped me. On my collarbone where something had torn. On the fur beneath my left hand, a dark smear that crinkled when I moved my fingers. My stomach lurched. The memory tried to rise. Hands, laughter, the specific sound a body makes when it hits frozen ground, and I shoved it back down with everything I had. Later. Not now. Breathe. That's when I heard the stillness break. He'd been standing near the window the entire time, motionless as the stone columns flanking the fireplace, and I'd missed him completely. But now he stepped forward into the firelight, and the room seemed to reorganize itself around him the way rooms do when the most significant thing in them finally moves. Tall. Brutally so. Wide across the shoulders in the way that suggested the width was bone, not vanity. Dark hair, almost black, cut close on the sides but longer on top, and falling slightly across a forehead that was currently creased with something between fury and a precision I didn't have a word for. His jaw was sharp enough to draw blood. His mouth was set in a line that communicated nothing comfortable. And his eyes. His eyes were the colour of amber held up to candlelight. Warm gold at the edges, deeper and more complex at the centre, and currently fixed on me with an intensity that bypassed every rational thought in my skull and spoke directly to the part of me that was still, underneath everything, an animal trying to assess a predator. He crossed the room in 4 strides. The floor didn't creak. Nothing about him made unnecessary sound. He stopped at a distance that was close enough to be intimate and far enough to be deliberate, and he looked at me. Not in the way I was used to being looked at, which was either through or at some part of me that had nothing to do with who I was. But at me. Full and direct and completely without the dismissal I'd learned to expect like I expected gravity. His voice when it came was low, controlled. Each word placed with the precision of someone doing serious work to keep the sounds even. Who did this to you? Not what happened. Not are you all right. Not the polite, distancing language of someone who wanted the answer without the weight of it. Who? As though the question had already decided something. As though the answer was the final piece of a calculation that had been running since before I opened my eyes. I should have been terrified. Every survival instinct I'd developed over 19 years of being Reva Ashmore, the Iron Veil Pack's lowest-ranking Omega, was screaming at me to lower my eyes, to make myself small, to produce the most harmless version of the truth and deliver it in the smallest possible voice. Alphas who asked questions like that with that particular vibration underneath the words were alphas building toward violence. I knew that. I'd learned it early and at considerable cost. But the rage beneath his words, and it was there, controlled and leashed and enormous, like a river running 10 feet below the surface, didn't feel aimed at me. It felt aimed at what had been done to me, which was a distinction I had almost no framework for, and which did something completely inexplicable to the hollow, cold place inside my chest. His right hand hovered near my face, not touching. The knuckles were white, and I could see the faint tremor running through his fingers. Not weakness, not hesitation, but the muscular evidence of extraordinary restraint. He was shaking with the effort of not moving, not toward me. Toward whatever it was his wolf wanted to do about what he'd seen when he found me. Who did this to you? Repeated. Lower. Heavier, like he was placing stones. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. I didn't know his name. I didn't know this room or this pack or how I'd arrived here or whether my circumstances had improved or simply changed shape. I knew nothing except that someone had put me in this bed and covered me with these furs and lit this fire, and that the man standing 3 feet from me was waiting for an answer, with a patience that lived in direct contradiction to the sheer volcanic pressure radiating from every inch of him. And I knew, with the particular clarity that comes when the body's too damaged to maintain comfortable illusions, that whoever had left me bleeding in those woods was already living on borrowed time. They just hadn't been informed yet. You probably deserve to understand how I ended up there. To understand that, you have to understand what it means to be an Omega in the Iron Veil Pack. Not the theoretical understanding, the academic grasp of pack hierarchy that outsiders sometimes discussed in careful voices at border meetings, shaking their heads at the customs of wilder territories. I mean the daily, granular, bone-level reality of it. The way it shaped every decision, every breath, every calculation of how much space it was safe to occupy on any given morning. The Iron Veil Pack had a system. Most packs did. But Iron Veil had refined theirs to something almost elegant in its brutality. A hierarchy so internalized, so thoroughly marinated into the culture, that most of the people enforcing it had stopped noticing they were doing it. It was simply how things were. The sky was blue. The moon pulled the tides. Omegas served, absorbed, endured, and vanished when no longer useful. I had learned the rules of my existence before I was old enough to understand they were rules, and not laws of physics. First rule, be invisible. Move through rooms like a draft. Answer only what was directly asked, with as few words as possible, in the lowest register that would still be heard. Complete tasks before being noticed completing them. Exit before your presence could become an inconvenience. The ideal Omega, in Iron Veil's model, he was one whose contributions were felt but whose existence was never acknowledged, like the oxygen in the room, necessary, unremarkable, utterly unworthy of attention. Second rule, suppress. Nature, whatever cruel architect designed the Omega designation, had made us something that apparently disrupted alphas in ways that were, according to everyone who benefited from our suppression, our fault. Our scent was too much. Our presence registered too strongly. So we spent what little money we were allowed on suppressants that tasted like chalk and made our joints ache. And we scrubbed ourselves with unscented soap until our skin was raw, and we layered ourselves in shapeless clothing that communicated nothing. And we prayed that no one got close enough to sense what we were beneath all the careful erasure. Because if they did, if an alpha caught your scent and decided to act on whatever it triggered, there were no mechanisms of recourse, no one to report to, no language in Iron Veil's rules for what happened to Omegas, who were wanted by someone who outranked them. Third rule, the one I had tattooed on the inside of every waking moment. Do not hope. Hope was the most dangerous indulgence available to someone in my position. Hope made you look up when you should keep your eyes down. Hope made you imagine alternatives to the thing in front of you when the thing in front of you required your entire attention to survive. I had watched hope destroy other Omegas, watched it make them careless, vulnerable, open to cruelties they might have avoided if they'd just accepted the parameters of their existence. So I didn't hope. I survived. Until Caden Voss decided he was bored. Caden was the beta's eldest son. 23, handsome in the aggressive way of someone who'd been told so too often, with his father's authority and none of his father's discipline. He had the particular cruelty of someone who'd grown up in a system that protected him completely and therefore had never needed to develop restraint. It started small. A hand on my arm that lingered. My name, not Omega, my actual name, which was worse because it meant he'd noticed me specifically. Comments delivered in undertones while I served meals, designed to make my hands shake so he could watch the tray slosh. 3 days before I woke in a stranger's bed covered in dried blood, I was sent to clean the eastern training ground after the evening meal. When I stepped outside, the air felt wrong. Too still. The particular quality of silence that isn't peaceful but anticipatory. I should have turned back, but Omegas don't refuse assignments. They came out of the shadow of the equipment shed. Caden first, with Dry and Silas flanking him, wearing the particular expression of people who've pre-decided something and are now simply executing. I ran. 30 feet before they caught me. What happened in those woods I locked away in a deep, dark place inside myself. Because if I let myself remember the details, I would shatter. And I couldn't afford to shatter. Not yet. I thought I'd die there. Then footsteps, heavy, deliberate, a voice like I'd never heard, low, deep, absolutely furious, cutting through the fog in my mind like a blade. Moon goddess, what has been done here? Strong arms lifted me from frozen ground. I tried to warn him that I was dirty, broken, that he shouldn't touch me. But nothing coherent reached my mouth. He held me against his chest, and the warmth of him, after the cold of the ground, was so overwhelming that something in me simply let go. Get Ren. Now. And find out who did this. A pause, quieter, voice dropping to carry only as far as my ears. Find out who allowed it. His arms adjusted, careful of the places that hurt most, as though he could already map my injuries by some sense I didn't understand. Then, just for me, I have you. You're safe now. I swear it. Despite everything I knew about alphas and promises and the particular way power structures use the language of protection while delivering the reality of ownership, I believed him. His name was Kaelior Vane. I learned this from Ren, the pack healer, a compact, one capable beta woman with steel grey eyes and hands that worked with the focused efficiency of someone who'd seen damage before and refused to be rattled by it. She told me while she cleaned my wounds on the second day when I could stay conscious long enough to process language. She told me like the name should mean something. Kaelior Vane, she repeated, watching my face. Alpha King of the Ashwood Territories. Unified the northern and western packs 11 years ago. Ended the border wars that had been running for decades. She met my eyes, and something in her expression made the back of my neck prickle. He's fair. Absolutely inflexibly fair. merciful to those who've earned mercy. A pause. Implacable toward those who haven't. She let that settle before continuing. You told him what happened while you were barely conscious, or enough that he understood. She resumed her work, her touch precise and gentle. The Iron Veil Beta's son and his companions were brought here by direct order before dawn. The air went out of the room. He called the assembled pack to the main ground, she said quietly. Made all three confess. Every detail, spoken aloud. Caden Voss tried to reframe it, said you'd invited the attention. She stopped, jaw tight. And Kaelior Vane? Asked him to explain the shape of the handprints on your throat, the claw marks on your wrists, the state in which you were found. Wren set down her instruments. Caden couldn't. So the truth came out entire. The Beta of Iron Veil attempted to negotiate, offered territory compensation, argued that execution was excessive for crimes against... She stopped. For crimes against just an Omega, I said. So she didn't have to. Yes. Her voice was barely above a whisper. What did Kaelior Vane say? Wren was quiet for a moment, like she was choosing how to carry the words before setting them down. There is no hierarchy that licenses brutality. There is no rank that permits what was done to her. There is no just when every person standing on territory I govern is my responsibility. She drew a careful breath. Then he stripped the Beta of his title, banished him from all Ashwood Territories, and sentenced all three men to death. He carried out the sentence himself at dawn. The fire crackled. Wind moved against stone outside. I pressed my hand against my sternum. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Or something stranger. The particular vertigo of a person who has been told so long that their suffering doesn't matter, that they have no emotional vocabulary. For the moment, it turns out, it does. He wants to see you, Wren said after a while. He's been outside this door since he returned, won't rest, just waiting. Why? The word came out before I could curate it. She looked at me with an expression that was equal parts compassion and something almost like sorrow. I think you should ask him that yourself. He looked different in the daylight. The firelit version of him had been all shadow and leashed violence. The morning version was more fully dimensional, the harsh lines of his face visible in complete light, the scar that crossed his left jaw in a thin white line, the way exhaustion had deepened the hollows beneath his cheekbones. His eyes in daylight were not simply amber but contained actual colour variation. Warm at the centre, darker at the edges, like something had been burning in them long enough to leave char. He settled in the chair beside the bed, with the deliberate care of someone choosing to make himself less large, less immediately overwhelming. He asked how I was feeling. I made a comment I hadn't intended to make, and the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. He told me he wouldn't apologise for what he'd done. I told him I wasn't asking him to. Then the silence shifted in quality, and I felt it before I understood it. Why does it matter? I asked. Why me? He didn't answer immediately. His jaw worked. He dragged a hand through his dark hair with the sudden restlessness of someone fighting the urge to move, and the motion pulled his shirt taut across his shoulders, across the broad architecture of his chest, and I was suddenly, uncomfortably aware of how much physical space he occupied even sitting still. How much warmth radiated from him across the short distance between his chair and my bed. How the scent that had been coating the room now seemed to intensify. Pine resin and dark earth and that electric storm charge, as though proximity to consciousness sharpened it. I made myself look at the fire instead. I don't have a clean answer, he said finally. Not one I'm prepared to offer you while you're still healing and have no reason to trust me. Try anyway. His eyes found mine, and whatever he saw there made him lean forward, elbows on his knees, closing the distance between us by a fraction. Enough that I could see the precise shade of gold in his irises, enough that I had to work not to lean in response. "When I found you," he said, low and careful, "something in me. Not the king part, not the alpha part. Something older than either of those things decided that whoever had done that to you was going to answer for it. Before I knew who you were. Before I understood why the urgency felt different from every other injustice I'd acted on." His hands were clasped between his knees, and I could see the tension in them. Controlled but present. "I've been asking myself since why you triggered that response. And I can't explain it by rank, or politics, or duty." The silence stretched, and then I smelled it. The cedar and earth scent had been coating the room since I woke, constant as the fire. But now something underneath it shifted, warmer, sweeter, a resonance that curled at the edges of my awareness and made the air feel charged in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Something my body recognized before my mind caught up. A correspondence, like hearing a note played on an instrument and feeling your own chest vibrate in answer. And I understood, with a clarity that was almost physically painful, that landed like a stone dropped from height. Why his scent had reached me even through suppressants and trauma and the fog of half-consciousness. Why his voice had penetrated places nothing else had reached in years. The bond. Oh, no. My heart started pounding. I knew with terrible certainty that he could hear it, that werewolf hearing at this proximity made that sound as obvious as speech, that he could probably sense the way my own scent had shifted in response to whatever was detonating between us. The omega in me, the part I'd been chemically suppressing for years, rose toward him like a plant turning toward light, and I had absolutely no framework for how to push it back down. He went very still. Not the stillness of someone pretending not to notice, the stillness of someone who is standing at the edge of something enormous and choosing with great care not to move toward it without permission. "Reva," he said, and it was the first time he'd used my name, just my name, not Omega, not girl, not the dozen diminishments I'd answered to, and the sound of it in his voice did something catastrophic to my composure. Something warm and devastating and entirely unwanted. "Don't," I said immediately. I wasn't going to say anything you don't already know. "Mate." The word occupied the air between us without being spoken. I could feel the bond. That's what it was, the thing I now understood with full-body certainty, humming behind my sternum like a second heartbeat that wasn't mine, pulling toward him with the patient, irresistible logic of tides. "No," I said. Something moved behind his eyes. "I can't." My voice cracked at the edges and I hated how much it revealed. "I can't be claimed. I can't belong to someone. Every omega who gets claimed by an alpha, it doesn't matter how it starts, what they promise at the beginning. The bond settles and we become extensions of someone else's will. We lose whatever ground we had." My throat tightened. "I have almost nothing left that's mine, but what I have, I need to keep." He was very still for a long moment, then quietly, "I understand." "Don't just—" "I understand," he repeated. The quietness of it carried more weight than volume would have. "I'm not going to claim you against your will. You can reject the bond. Walk away from this room, these territories, all of it. I'll arrange resources and protection to help you start somewhere new." His eyes held mine, steady and completely clear. "Your choice. Completely and always." I looked for the manipulation in it. I searched with everything I had, every instinct sharpened by years of learning to read the space between what alphas said and what they meant. I didn't find it. "And if I stay?" The question came out before I decided to ask it. Something shifted in his expression. Not triumph. Nothing like triumph. something closer to hope held very carefully, like a flame cupped in both hands against wind. "Then we figure out what that means together," he said. "No claim before you're ready. No timeline, no expectation, just time. To heal. To decide what you want instead of what's expected." He held my gaze, and the gold in his was warm and absolutely serious. "I won't lie to you about what I feel. The pull is already there, and I can't switch it off any more than I can switch off my own heartbeat. But feeling it doesn't give me any right to anything." The fire crackled. The bond hummed. "I've never had a choice before," I said. "About anything? I don't know how to make one." "You just did," he said, "several in the last 10 minutes alone." His eyes were warm. "You've been making choices this whole time, Reva. They just looked like survival because the conditions required it. They were never only survival." He stood slowly, giving me time to register the movement, moved toward the door and paused at the frame. "Whatever you decide about the bond, it doesn't change your safety here. Those things aren't contingent on each other." "Why?" I asked again. Different question this time. He looked at me across the room, and in the morning light his amber eyes were very clear. "Because it was right," he said simply. Then, quieter. "The honesty of someone who's decided the performance of nobility isn't worth the cost of pretending. And because even before I knew what you were to me, every instinct I had was screaming that whoever hurt you needed to answer for it. I'm not entirely as noble as I've been presenting." The ghost of that almost smile. "But the result is the same." Then he was gone. The door clicked shut with the specific finality of something changing shape. I lay back and pressed my palm flat against my sternum and felt the bond pulsing there, warm and patient and entirely too certain of itself. And thought about how hope was supposed to be the most dangerous thing available to someone in my position. I was beginning to suspect the danger was exactly the point. The days that followed were a particular kind of exquisite difficulty I hadn't anticipated. Kaelior came twice daily, morning and evening, always knocking, always waiting. He brought books the first time, setting them on the table beside my bed with the careful casualness of someone who had thought about the gesture more than they wanted to admit. He sat in the chair and we talked about everything except what mattered most. The territories, pack history, the structural problems with a hierarchy built on tradition rather than merit, the particular way winter light fell differently on the eastern courtyard than the western. Small things, safe things. But the bond didn't care about safe things. By the third day, I had catalogued him the way you catalogue a danger you cannot avoid. The way he held tension in his left shoulder when something troubled him. The way his hands moved when he explained something he was passionate about. The scar along his jaw, white and fine, that he'd gotten defending a border settlement 11 years ago. According to Wren, who had mentioned it with the particular tone of someone sharing information they thought I'd want and couldn't quite justify having. By the fourth day, I noticed that he always positioned his chair at an angle, close enough to talk easily, far enough to give me the specific gift of space, that he never touched anything of mine without asking first, that when our hands accidentally brushed once, reaching for the same book simultaneously, he went absolutely motionless for half a second like he was absorbing the contact, and then, carefully, deliberately, moved his hand away. "You don't have to do that," I said. He looked at me. "Move away." The words came out before I could reconsider them. "Every time. Like I'm something that will break. You're healing. I'm not made of glass." I met his eyes directly and watched something shift in the amber depths. "I know you're being careful. I know why. But the constant distance," I stopped, not entirely sure what I was asking for or why the careful architecture of his restraint was somehow harder to endure than straightforward proximity would have been. He studied me for a moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he moved the chair 3 inches closer. It shouldn't have felt significant. It was 3 inches of stone floor. but the bond registered it like a seismic event, and when the warmth of him reached me across the shortened distance, that pine and earth and storm-charged scent that I had stopped fighting 3 days in, I understood suddenly why he'd been keeping the gap. Not for my protection only, for his own. The bond, I said quietly. It's worse when you're close. Yes. His voice was carefully even. Does it? I hesitated. Does it hurt? The knot. Some. He met my eyes with the directness that was, I was learning, simply how he operated. No performance, no management of impression. The pull toward you it's significant. Saying no to it requires active effort. A pause. But I'd rather feel that than make you feel unsafe, without question. I looked at his hands, those large, scarred, carefully controlled hands resting on his knees, and thought about what it cost him to sit 3 feet from his fated mate while she was deciding whether he was trustworthy. Thought about the quality of patience required for that. Thought about how every alpha I'd ever known had treated restraint as optional. I don't feel unsafe, I said. With you, I should. By every rule I've ever learned, I should be terrified of you. But your anger has never once pointed at me. I said it slowly, working out the architecture of the realization as I spoke it. Even when I said no, even when I pushed back, it aims somewhere else, somewhere I'd aim it to if I had the power. I paused. That's new. For me. That's something I don't have a category for. He was quiet for a moment. You should have a category for it, he said finally. It should be the baseline, not the exception. His jaw tightened. Not at me. At the system that had made it exceptional. That it isn't. That you've lived your entire life without someone directing their anger appropriately. He stopped himself. Let out a slow breath. I'm sorry. That you had to learn the world that way. Don't apologize for other people's choices. I'm not. I'm apologizing that the world I govern allowed those choices to go unanswered for so long. He met my eyes. That's mine to carry. The fire crackled between us. I moved 3 inches closer to him. It was a small thing, a nearly imperceptible shift on the bed, closing the gap he'd so carefully maintained. But I watched his breath change, just slightly, just enough, and the gold in his eyes deepened, and the bond sang between us like a plucked string finding resonance. Neither of us mentioned it. But when he left that evening, he paused at the door longer than usual and looked back at me with an expression that was entirely unmanaged, entirely honest. Want and restraint, in equal measure. So visible on his face that it hurt to look at directly, like the amber light of the fire itself. Good night, Reva, he said. Good night, Kaelior. The door closed. I pressed my hand over my heart and felt it racing and thought, this is what the moon goddess decided to do with my survival. This is what she had planned for me in those woods. Not death. Not rescue and recovery and quiet disappearance into some safer anonymity. This. I wasn't sure whether to be grateful or furious. I suspected both were appropriate. Enter Mira on the 5th morning. Not in the soft, sideways manner of someone making themselves unobtrusive. She arrived the way she apparently did everything. Directly, efficiently, with the air of a person who has decided that every moment spent on preamble is a moment not spent on something that matters. She knocked twice, opened the door without waiting for an answer, and set a stack of documents on my table with the particular authority of someone who has been managing powerful people for long enough to have stopped performing deference toward anyone. You're Reva Ashmore, she said. Not a question. I'm Mira. I run the Alpha Kings Advisory Council, manage pack policy across 7 territories, and have been trying to reform Omega rights structures for approximately a decade with the following results. She sat in the chair Kaelior had vacated an hour ago and spread her hands flatly on her knees. None. Functionally none. Some cosmetic changes, some language adjustments in the formal charters that changed nothing in practice. I stared at her. She was perhaps 45, and with silver threading through dark hair that she wore pulled back with ruthless practicality, her eyes were the particular shade of brown that suggested they'd seen enough to stop being surprised by most things, and there was something in the set of her jaw. A compressed, weathered determination that I recognized as the expression of someone who has been fighting a very long fight and is not, by any measure, finished with it. You, in 1 week, she continued, have accomplished more structural disruption to that system than I managed in a decade of careful political navigation. 3 executions, a beta stripped of title, an Alpha King on record, as classifying Omega harm as a matter of royal justice. She looked at me steadily. I wanted to meet you. Why? I asked. And because what you've started, even if you didn't intend to start it, is going to require strategy to finish. Raw courage without direction gets people killed and changes nothing permanently. I've watched it happen. She paused. But strategy without someone willing to be the face of it, willing to stand in rooms and say the things that strategies only whisper, that fails too. I've watched that happen also. I studied her the way she was studying me, looking for the angle, the way everyone had an angle when they approached you with something that looked like alliance. What I found instead was exhaustion, the specific kind that comes from caring about something for a very long time without sufficient company in that caring. What do you want from me? I asked. Nothing you haven't already decided to give, she said. I want you to understand what you've walked into. I want you to have information instead of just instinct, though your instincts, I'll note, are considerably better than most. She pulled one of the documents from the stack. I've been compiling this for 6 years, documented cases pack by pack, what was done to Omegas and what the official response was. She set it on the bed beside me. Read it. Or don't. But I wanted you to know it exists, that someone has been watching and recording even when no one was listening. I looked at the document, at the dense, careful handwriting covering page after page. You did this alone? I asked. Mostly. Something flickered across her face. There are others. A network, small, careful. Her betas and omegas who've been quietly building the evidentiary foundation for the argument you made in that council chamber 5 days ago. She met my eyes. You said what we've been documenting for years. Except you said it where it couldn't be ignored. The silence had a different quality now, less charged than the silences with Kaelior. No bond humming underneath it, no awareness of proximity and its complicated mathematics, but weighted in its own way, with the particular gravity of 2 people who have been carrying separate pieces of the same thing and have just, unexpectedly, found each other. The council session, I said. Drevenholt's challenge. You know what it actually is. I know exactly what it is. Her voice was flat and certain. It's the beginning of the organized opposition. Not to Kaelior specifically. His rule is too entrenched to challenge on its merits, but to what he represents now, to the precedent. They're not trying to remove a king. They're trying to ensure this. She gestured at me, at the documents, at the whole complicated situation. Doesn't become a template. They're trying to make sure what happened to me stays exceptional, I said, so it can't become standard. Precisely. She looked at me with something that wasn't quite approval. It was past approval, into the territory of a different recognition. Kaelior is going to fight this. He'll fight it as a matter of principle and he'll fight it as a matter of... Her eyes were very direct. Personal investment. What he needs is for the argument to not be reducible to personal investment. He needs it to be bigger than the bond. Bigger than 1 Omega and 1 Alpha King. He needs the data, I said. He needs the data, and the testimony and the political architecture that turns a story into a policy. She began restacking her documents with practiced efficiency. I've been building that architecture for years. I've been waiting for the moment it had somewhere to go. She looked up at me. Don't waste it by being careful now. She left the documents. I spent the rest of the morning reading, and what I found in those pages settled into me like cold iron. Case after case, pack after pack, the same story told in different names and different geographies, the same absence of consequence, the same erasure, hundreds of Revas, hundreds of untold stories that Mira had gathered and catalogued and carried alone for years. The bond between Kaelior and me hummed warm and constant at the edge of my awareness. But these pages, this was something else, something that didn't need a mate bond to matter. Something that needed to matter whether or not I was fated to an Alpha King. By afternoon, I knew what I was going to do, and when Wren arrived at dusk to tell me that Kaelior had ordered me to stay away from the emergency council session, I was already dressed. The chamber was everything I'd feared and nothing I hadn't. Stone arches over a round table, 7 chairs for 7 alphas. The walls carved with territorial histories in the language of dominance and lineage. The air itself felt pressurized, all that concentrated alpha authority in one room, layered thick enough to make even the uninitiated understand that the room was not designed for them. I walked in anyway. The silence was comprehensive, 7 faces turned toward me, and the weight of their collective assessment was a physical thing. Pressing, calculating, finding me small and not finding that surprising. Kaelior was at the head of the table. The look on his face when he saw me, pure fury, immediate and contained, directed not at me, but at the situation, at whatever barrier he'd tried to keep me behind. Did something complicated to my breathing that I couldn't afford to examine right now. Dreven Holt was speaking, grey-haired and cold-eyed, polished with the particular assurance of someone who has held authority long enough to believe in it, independently of whether he's earned it today. Unprecedented. 3 executions and a banishment for crimes against an Omega. She's with me, Kaelior said, and his voice cut across Holt's like something with an edge. She stays. I caught Mira's eyes from where she stood against the far wall. Her expression communicated nothing except the specific quality of attention of someone watching a very important play at a critical juncture. You're right, I said. Complete silence. You're absolutely right, I continued, and the acoustics of the chamber carried my voice farther than expected. His response was extreme. 3 executions and a banishment for crimes against an Omega. Nothing like that has happened in these territories in living memory. I took a step toward the table. Which is exactly the problem. Holt frowned. I'm not sure You're calling his judgment extreme because it treated an Omega's suffering as something that warranted a response. Or you're calling it compromised because it held alphas accountable for what they did to someone the system classified as having no grounds for redress. I reached into the document I'd carried in from Mira's stack, unfolded it, and set it on the table in front of the nearest alpha. 6 years of documented cases, pack by pack, territory by territory, crimes against Omegas and their official outcomes. I met Holt's eyes and held them. Do you know what the consistent outcome is? Across 6 years and 4 territories, silence. Nothing, I said. No formal proceedings, no record, no consequence. I let that sit. His response wasn't extreme. His response was proportionate. The only reason it looks extreme is because you've normalized a baseline of nothing. Murmurs rippled through the council. The real question, I continued, Ika addressing the entire table, isn't whether the Alpha King's judgment is clouded, it's whether yours has been all along. Whether you've been so comfortable with Omega suffering that basic justice looks like favoritism. Holt's expression had arrived at cold anger. You overstep. I have nothing left to lose. The words were true, and I let them be true. You can dismiss everything I've said. You can remove me from this room, but you cannot make me invisible again, and you cannot undo what he did, which was show every Omega in these territories that someone in power considers their lives worth defending. I turned to Kaelior, and the look on his face, pride and concern and something fiercer mixed together, the gold of his eyes burning brighter than usual, nearly undid my composure entirely. I didn't ask to be here, I said, softer now. I didn't ask for this bond, or this conversation, or any of it, but I will not apologize for it, and I refuse to watch him punished for doing what every leader should do, protecting the powerless instead of enabling the powerful. I stepped back. The adrenaline was already ebbing. Vote, I finished. Challenge his authority, but don't pretend that justice for Omegas is the problem. The problem is that it took this long. I turned and walked out, spine straight, head high. I made it halfway down the corridor before my legs gave out. Mira was there before I hit the wall. She didn't catch me so much as materialize at my elbow, appearing with the competent efficiency of someone who had anticipated exactly this moment and positioned herself accordingly. One hand steadied my arm, the other pressed briefly against my back, and then withdrew the moment I had my footing. "Breathe," she said, not unkindly. "You're not fine, but you will be. Breathe." I breathed. She waited, which I was coming to understand was something she was exceptionally good at, the specific patience of someone who has learned that most problems resolve themselves faster when you don't rush them. That was either brilliant or catastrophic, I said finally. Both, probably. She studied me with those weathered, seen-everything eyes. In my experience, the things that are genuinely worth doing tend to be both simultaneously. She glanced toward the council chamber doors. "You used the documentation." It felt like the right moment. It was exactly the right moment. Something in her expression shifted, past her usual controlled assessment into something warmer and more complicated. "I've been waiting for someone to put that evidence in front of that table for 6 years. I couldn't do it myself. My position requires a particular kind of neutrality that loses its usefulness the moment I'm perceived as an advocate rather than an advisor." She met my eyes. "You had nothing to be neutral about. And you provided the ammunition. And you had the nerve to fire it." She paused. "There's going to be backlash. Beyond the council. People who benefit from how things are don't accept documentation and testimony as reasons to change. They accept them as provocations." Her voice was careful, and neither alarmist nor dismissive. "You need to understand what you've set in motion. I think I already have enemies. You have old enemies. You're about to have organized ones." She straightened. "Which means you need allies with equivalent organization." She looked at me steadily. "I've been building that network for years. It was missing a center, a face, a voice, a reason for people on the fence to choose a side." Her eyes were very direct. "I'd like to formally offer you everything I've built, if you'll work with me." I looked at her. At this woman who had spent a decade gathering evidence alone, waiting for a moment that might never have come, carrying the weight of hundreds of stories that no one else had thought worth keeping. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "You're a beta. Or you're not. This doesn't affect you the way it affects." "My mother was an Omega," she said simply. "She died when I was 11. The circumstances." She paused, and something moved across her face that she controlled before it could fully surface, were not unusual. By Iron Veil standards, by most pack standards. She met my eyes. "I have been making this my business since I was old enough to understand what I'd watched happen to her. The silence between us was different from any silence I'd experienced in this palace. Not charged, not complicated by bond or hierarchy. Just human." Two people who had both been shaped by the same brutal system from different angles, standing in a corridor outside a room where that system was being challenged, choosing together what to do next. "Yes," I said. I'll work with you." Something in her face, or that compressed weathered determination, finally softened. Just slightly. Just enough. "Good," she said. "We'll start tomorrow. Tonight, I suggest you go back to your rooms before the Alpha King finishes in that chamber and finds you collapsed in a corridor, because the diplomatic consequences of his reaction to that scenario would set us back at least a week." I almost laughed. "He'll be furious regardless." "He'll be furious and worried," she corrected. "Those are different problems with different management requirements." She turned me gently toward the corridor. "Go. I'll send word when the session ends." They came in the dark, 3 days later. I woke to war cries, the specific terrible harmonics of multiple wolves in organized violence, not grief or ceremony but hunting. The sound of a decision already made. The window showed me the courtyard in chaos. Dozens of wolves streaming through the gates, the crescent insignia of my old pack among them, mixed with Eastern Territory colours. A coalition, assembled against everything Kaelior's choices represented. Against me. Wren came to get me, told me there was a passage, an exit, a safe route out. I told her no. "Where is he?" I asked. "Courtyard. He's been holding them back, but there are too many. This was coordinated, Reva. They're not just trying to silence you, they're trying to take everything he's built." I grabbed the nearest cloak. "Take me to him." The courtyard was blood and fire and chaos, and Kaelior Vane at the centre of it was the most extraordinary thing I had ever seen. He had shifted partially, maintaining enough human form to speak and command, but with his wolf strength and speed fully present, and in that half form, he was devastating. He stood a full head taller than even the largest wolves facing him, his frame broader and more densely powerful than his human form had suggested, as though the shift had revealed what the civilized facade kept politely contained. His dark hair had gone wild, his eyes blazed pure molten gold, and the marks of battle were written across him in blood and torn fabric. A gash along his forearm, a cut above his brow sending a dark streak down one side of his face, and a wound at his ribs that he was working not to favour. He moved like something that had been designed specifically for this. Not the brutal efficiency of someone who enjoys violence, but the terrible precision of someone who has learned it as the cost of protecting things worth protecting. Each opponent he engaged was dispatched without excess, without cruelty, without any of the performative dominance I'd seen from alphas who fought to demonstrate power rather than defend people. He fought like a king, like someone who understood that every wolf on that ground, on both sides, was ultimately his responsibility, and who carried that knowledge into every calculated movement. But they were outnumbered 3-1. For every wolf he turned back, 2 more pressed through the gates. The Royal Guard fought valiantly and exhaustedly at his flanks, and even from 30 feet away, I could see the weariness in their movements. They had been holding this breach since before I'd woken, and the fresh wolves pouring in against them were rested, coordinated, staged. Then from the far gate, Drevon Holt. He came fully shifted, and the transformation from the cold-eyed alpha of the council chamber into his wolf form was stark. His wolf was large, pale-coated as winter stone, with the particular mass of an alpha who had been at his peak for decades and built his power through accumulated dominance rather than born authority. He moved through the courtyard centre with deliberate theatre, and the fighting slowed around him. Both sides pulling back, recognising what this was. Single combat, the ancient resolution, alpha against alpha. Winner takes everything. The crowd parted. The space between them cleared. Kaelior rolled his shoulders. I saw him do it. You saw the adjustment in his posture as his wolf rose fully to meet the challenge, and then shifted. The change moved through him like a tide, and what emerged was, I had no adequate vocabulary for what emerged. His wolf was massive, not large the way Holt's wolf was large, massive in the way of something that exists at a different scale from the things around it. Black-coated, so deeply black that the firelight barely found purchase on it, with that same dense, ancient power that his human form carried, but now without any civilized architecture around it. His eyes in wolf form were pure burning gold, not amber, not the warm honey tones of his human gaze, but the cold, precise gold of something absolute. His wolf carried no performance, no display for the watching crowd. It simply existed with the complete, a devastating confidence of something that has never once doubted its own nature. He was magnificent. The realization hit me at exactly the wrong moment, with exactly the wrong weight. Not the intellectual acknowledgement of an impressive predator, but something warm and immediate and deeply, inconveniently personal. The bond blazed bright in response, recognizing its other half with a certainty that bypassed every reasonable objection I'd built against it. I pressed my palm against my sternum and made myself focus. They circled. The courtyard was absolutely silent except for the fire in the braziers and the distant sound of the last skirmishes dying down as everyone's attention fixed on the center. "You chose weakness," Holt said, his wolf's voice distorting the consonants but carrying the contempt clean and clear. "You chose sentiment over strength, an omega over your authority, over everything you built." Kaelior didn't answer. He moved. They collided with a sound like stone splitting against stone, a concussive impact that I felt in my chest from 30 feet away. They went down together in a tangle of black and pale grey, massive bodies rolling across blood-slicked cobblestone with a violence that made everyone watching involuntarily step back. Teeth found fur, claws found flesh. Both wolves bled. Both wolves fought through it. Kaelior was stronger. I could see it. His wolf had the edge of raw power, the deeper reserves of an alpha who had been forged in actual battle rather than political maneuvering. He drove Holt back twice, 3 times, each time pressing the advantage with that terrible measured efficiency. But Holt was patient and fresh, and Kaelior's injured ribs were slowing him in increments too small to see without watching carefully. Then Holt looked at me, directly, deliberately, with the cold satisfaction of someone who had planned for exactly this variable. Kaelior's golden eyes flicked to me, just for a fragment of a second, that involuntary mate bond check, is she safe? And Holt drove into his injured side with everything he had, driving him into the ground, jaws going for the throat. No, the bond decided. My body followed. I ran between 2 shifted alphas in the middle of a territory war, which was either the most courageous or the most catastrophically stupid thing I had ever done. And I screamed. Not a word, not a name, just pure, undiluted refusal. The sound of a person who has been told she doesn't matter and has decided, finally, permanently, or to stop cooperating with that assessment. Both wolves froze. Holt stared at me like I had grown a second head. Kaelior's golden eyes went wide, and what I felt through the bond in that moment was absolute terror, not for himself, but for me, for what I'd placed myself in front of, for the completely irrational and entirely characteristic thing I had just done. Good, I thought at him through whatever channel the bond provided. Now let me finish it. Enough, I said. The word hit the courtyard like a stone into still water. I turned to face the assembled wolves, attackers and defenders alike, every eye in the courtyard fixed on the Omega, standing between 2 Alpha Kings in the middle of a war. "You want to know if the bond compromised him," I said, and my voice carried farther than my body had any right to project right now. "You want to know if caring about me made him weak?" I looked at them, at all of them. Every face, every pair of eyes. "Look at me. I'm an Omega, I have no rank, no territory, no political weight, no claim on any of your loyalties. And I'm standing in the middle of your war, asking you to stop. Not because I have the power to make you, but because someone has to say out loud that this is insane. Silence. I stopped fighting the bond, stopped arguing with it, stopped holding it at arm's length. I let it in. All of it. And felt Kaelior through it with full clarity. His exhaustion, his pain, his fear for me, enormous and immediate. And underneath everything else, bedrock deep, completely unassailable, the thing that had made him walk into a dark forest and ask who did this to you with the voice of someone who had already decided the answer mattered. The bond didn't make him weak. It had given him something worth being strong for. He's not compromised by caring about me, I said. You're compromised by being so afraid of change that you'd rather burn everything down than admit you've been wrong. I met Holt's wolf eyes directly and did not look away. Every Omega in these territories is watching what happens in this courtyard. Every wolf who's been told their suffering is acceptable, their existence is insignificant, their pain is just the cost of the system. They're watching. And what they need to see is that the old order requires our silence to survive. The moment we stop being silent, as the justifications fall apart. I stepped forward, placed myself between Kaelior and Holt one final time. So ask yourself, I said, is maintaining your power worth this war? Because I promise you, the world is changing, whether you yield tonight or not. The only question is which side of that change you want to be standing on. Holt shifted back to human form. He stood there, breathing hard, his expression moving through several things. Then, quietly, I yield. The challenge is withdrawn. The tension broke like a snapped cord. The sun came up red that morning, painting blood-stained stones in shades that looked, for a moment, almost beautiful. Kaelior shifted back to human form beside me, and immediately wrapped his arms around me, blood-soaked and injured and entirely unconcerned with either of those things. That, he said into my hair, his voice rough and low and vibrating with something that wasn't quite steady, was the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed. And I have been in 7 territorial wars. It worked, I said into his chest. It worked because you are apparently immune to self-preservation instinct. His arms tightened. I felt your fear through the bond, and then I felt you override it and run directly toward the thing causing it. Do you know how— He stopped, started again. I aged approximately 20 years in the 10 seconds before Holt froze. He froze because he didn't expect it. No one expects an Omega to run between 2 shifted alphas, because it's insane. It ended the fight. He pulled back slightly to look at me, and his amber eyes returned now to their human warmth. The wolf's gold receding, were fierce and unguarded and completely unmanaged. His hands came up to frame my face, those large scarred hands, careful even now of the places that had been hurt. I chose, I told him. In case that wasn't sufficiently clear from the whole standing between you and an enemy alpha situation. The bond. You. All of it. I'm done fighting it. Something moved across his face. Relief and want, and something deeper that I didn't have the vocabulary for yet, but was beginning to understand was the specific language of a person who has been hoping very carefully for something and has just been told the hoping was warranted. Thank the moon goddess, he said quietly. He pressed his forehead against mine, and we stood like that in the middle of the ravaged courtyard while the sun rose and the healers came, and the long, difficult work of aftermath began around us. By evening, something extraordinary was happening in the great hall. Not the aftermath of battle specifically. The wounded being tended, the dead prepared for ceremony, the survivors processing survival in the particular ways people do. That was happening too, and it was hard to watch, And I watched it anyway because looking away felt like a disrespect to what it had cost. But at the edges of that, in the spaces between crisis and exhaustion, something else was quietly assembling itself. Mira was at the center of it. She moved through the hall with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment for years and was not going to waste it on anything less than complete utilization. I watched her work, speaking quietly to an alpha from the eastern borders who had fought on the wrong side and knelt at the end, something I saw him receive with discomfort that slowly shifted toward consideration. Sitting with a group of Omegas who had emerged from the lower pack quarters to offer help with the wounded, speaking to each of them with the specific directness of someone who is accustomed to being the only one who looks at them like they're worth speaking to directly, placing papers, her documentation, her 6 years of evidence, into the hands of every council member who was present and hadn't left, with the particular calm of someone who has been holding these papers for a very long time and knows exactly their weight. "She's been doing that all day," Kaelior said quietly, appearing at my side. His wounds were bandaged. Finally, after a small war with Wren about prioritization. He was still pale, still moving with the careful economy of someone whose ribs were communicating strong opinions. He watched Mira with an expression that mixed respect with something that looked like long overdue recognition. I owe her an apology. For what? For underutilizing her for 11 years. He looked at me. She's been trying to tell me this needed to happen. For years. I listened and implemented the small things, the language changes, the charter amendments, and told myself that was sufficient. That gradual was sustainable. His jaw tightened. She knew gradual wasn't working. And I just wasn't ready to hear how much was actually required. And now? Now I've watched an Omega I'm mated to stand between me and an Alpha King and end a battle that I was losing, he said, with a directness that was entirely characteristic. And I've accepted that my model of what's possible has been significantly revised. Mira looked up from across the hall and found our eyes. She gave a small, precise nod. Not deference, something more like equals acknowledging each other across a shared effort. And returned to the person she was speaking to. "She wants to formalize her role," I said. "Not just advisory. She wants actual authority to implement the policy reforms she's been architecting." Kaelior looked at me. "She told me 3 days ago," I said, "when she brought me the documentation. She's been waiting for the political moment to exist where it would be viable. The moment exists now." "Yes." I met his eyes. I told her I'd advocate for it. Something in his expression shifted. Warm and unhesitating. Done. We walked across the hall together and I watched Mira register our approach with the particular attention of someone who has learned to read the meaning of how people move toward them. The calculation was visible and brief. Then she finished her sentence to the alpha she'd been speaking with, excused herself, and turned to face us. "Formal appointment," Kaelior said, without preamble. "Commissioner of Pack Welfare, with full authority to investigate and adjudicate cases involving all Omega rights violations across all 7 territories. Reporting directly to the Crown. Effective immediately." Mira was quiet for a moment. "I'll need a staff," she said, "and a formal charter, and the right to compel testimony from any pack member regardless of rank." Agreed, and agreed. She looked at him steadily. "You understand this is going to be deeply uncomfortable for approximately 40% of your political relationships." "I'm aware." "And you're—" "I'm aware," he repeated, with the particular firmness that was, I was learning, his version of a full stop. "I should have done it years ago. I didn't, because I told myself the cost was too high. I was wrong about what the cost of not doing it would be." He glanced at me briefly. "I've had my understanding of costs significantly revised this week." Mira held his gaze for another moment. Then she extended her hand and Kaelior shook it. But there are 47 cases in the current documentation that require immediate review, she said, already moving into the work with the efficiency of someone who has been ready for this moment for years. I'd like to begin in the morning. Begin tonight if you can, Kaelior said. We've already lost enough time. Mira looked at him with an expression I suspected she reserved for very few people. Yes, she said simply. We have. I woke before him. The room was grey with pre-dawn light, the fire burned to embers, and Kaelior slept beside me with the absolute stillness of someone who had been running on adrenaline for days and had finally, completely let go. His arm was around me, careful even in sleep of the places that still ached. His breathing was deep and even and alive in the specific way that matters when you've been close enough to its possible ending to stop taking it as given. I lay still and watched him and thought about all of it, the whole shape of it, the frozen ground and the cedar scent and the amber eyes asking who did this to you with the voice of someone who had already decided the answer would change something. I pressed my palm against my sternum and felt the bond pulsing there, warm and settled now, no longer the urgent, questioning hum of something being resisted. It had the quality of something that has found its right place, like a key that has been living in the wrong lock. Finally inserted correctly, he stirred, his eyes opened and found me immediately, yeets with that particular reflex I'd noticed over days of observation. The first thing his waking mind did was locate me. You're watching me sleep, he said. You watched me sleep for 4 days, I said. Consider us even. The corner of his mouth curved. His hand moved from my waist to my face. Those large, careful hands, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a deliberateness that was entirely intentional. Not the accident of proximity, not the careful restraint he'd been exercising for days. A choice. I leaned into it. He went very still at that. At the small, significant fact of me choosing contact instead of receiving it. Hi, he said quietly. Hi, I said. The fire crackled as the last embers found new fuel. Outside, the first birds were beginning, the specific morning sounds of a world resuming after catastrophe, cautiously, the way things do when they're not sure yet what shape they're resuming into. The council meeting is in 2 hours, I said, not moving. I know. Mira will have the first case files ready for formal review. I know. There will probably be at least 3 alphas who try to procedurally challenge my presence in the chamber. Almost certainly, his thumb continued its slow path, and you will dismantle all 3 of them, and they will regret every word. I'll need those documents Mira gave me. They're on the table. I pulled back slightly to look at him, at this alpha who had spent 11 years governing an enormous territory and learning, apparently, that there were things he'd gotten wrong and that being wrong was not a catastrophe but a direction. Who had given me choice when he could have simply claimed. Who had shaken with the effort of restraint every time I'd been close enough to touch. I want to do the claiming, I said. Soon, when we're both healed. His eyes blazed gold. I want everyone to know I chose this, I continued, that it wasn't the bond pulling me toward you passively, that I looked at what you are and decided, with full understanding of what it means and what it costs, to choose you back. Actively. On purpose. You're sure? I'm completely sure. I held his gaze. Are you sure? Because you're getting an Omega with a documented habit of running between shifted alphas and absolutely no regard for self-preservation in high-stakes moments. His laugh, rich and unguarded and entirely real, filled the room. I'm sure, he said. So though we are absolutely going to work on the self-preservation instinct situation, says the man who fought an army while injured, that's different. It's exactly the same. He pulled me closer and pressed his lips to my temple, warm and deliberate and entirely unhurried, the gesture of someone who has stopped bracing for the thing they want to be taken away. I felt it everywhere the bond reached, which was everywhere. Mira already sent a draft policy through last night, he said, against my hair. The Omega Rights Charter. She had it ready years ago, apparently, just waiting for the political moment. A pause. She annotated it with historical documentation going back 40 years. I've never seen anything like it. She's been waiting a long time, I said. For someone to take it seriously. She's going to be remarkable, he said. She already is remarkable. I was just too comfortable with Gradual to see it. He was quiet for a moment. I think she and you together are going to make my council meetings significantly more interesting than they've historically been. Is that a complaint? It's a statement of gratitude. His arms tightened. I've needed someone to keep me honest for 11 years. It turns out what I actually needed was 2 people to keep me honest, with different areas of specialty. I thought about that. About Mira in the Great Hall last night, finally given the authority she'd earned, moving through the space with the efficiency of someone who no longer had to root everything through layers of political delicacy. About the cases already being reviewed. About the 47 Omegas whose harm had been documented and set aside, and was now, finally, going to be addressed. 3 Omegas had arrived from the Southern Territories 2 days ago. Petitioners, Kaelior had said. Then yesterday 5 more from the western border packs. How many today? I asked. He knew what I meant. Mira counted 9 new petitions before dawn. 9. From territories that had heard, through the specific rapid channels of pack communication, that something different was possible in the Ashwood. Not salvation. Not a magic reversal of everything that had been wrong for generations. Just an acknowledgement that it had been wrong. That someone in authority had decided the wrongness mattered. Or that there was a woman with 47 case files and a freshly chartered commissioner's authority who was going to spend every available hour addressing it. Sometimes that's enough to start. We should get up, I said. The meeting. 2 hours. Mira will want to brief us before... Reva. He said my name with that particular quality. The one that had dismantled me the first time he'd used it, and had continued to dismantle me reliably since. We have 2 hours. The council has waited 11 years for this reform. It can wait another 20 minutes. I looked at him. 20 minutes. He repeated. What are we doing for 20 minutes? He raised an eyebrow. The gold in his eyes was warm and entirely unhurried, and suggested he had some specific ideas about how 20 minutes might be spent. How something caught fire in my chest that had nothing to do with the bond and everything to do with the person looking at me. The specific, unprecedented, entirely new experience of being looked at by someone who saw me fully and had decided on that basis that I was worth wanting. Not because of the bond, because of me. I kissed him. Not the gentle, tentative contact of someone testing permissions. Something real. My hand against his jaw, his arms drawing me closer, with a care that had nothing to do with fragility and everything to do with being, finally, certain of a welcome. The bond blazed between us, warm and complete and absolutely right. But underneath it, something even more fundamental, the simple, extraordinary fact of 2 people choosing each other. When we finally, reluctantly separated, his forehead was pressed to mine and his eyes were pure gold and his breathing was not quite steady. 20 minutes, he said, voice rough. 20 minutes, I agreed. Then we go change the world. His smile, full and warm and entirely unguarded, was the best thing I'd seen in my entire life. We walked to the council chamber together, his hand in mine, the bond settled and warm between us. The doors opened. The alphas rose. Mira was already seated at the table, her new charter position, her annotated documents, her 6 years of evidence arranged before her with the quiet authority of someone who has waited long enough and intends to make every moment count. She looked up when we entered and gave that small, precise nod that I was beginning to understand was her version of considerable warmth. I took my seat at Kaelior's side, met every pair of eyes in the room without looking away first, and thought, let them see. Let every one of them see exactly what an Omega becomes when someone asks her who she is instead of telling her. Let's begin, Kaelior said. And as the council came to order, as Mira opened the first case file and began to speak with the measured, devastating precision of someone who has been preparing this argument for years, I understood something that had been assembling itself all week in the spaces between crisis and survival and the slow, complicated work of learning to be chosen. I had spent 19 years believing the rules I'd learned were laws, that invisibility was safety, that silence was wisdom, that wanting better was a luxury I hadn't earned. But the rules had been written by people who needed me small to feel large, and I was done cooperating with that. Outside, in the territories that stretched beyond the palace walls, change was moving, slowly, unevenly, at the speed of hearts and minds rather than the speed of battle. It would take years. It would cost things none of us could anticipate. There would be days when it felt like for every door we opened, 3 more slammed shut, and the weight of what remained would be staggering. But 9 Omegas had come to these walls this morning because they'd heard something different was possible. And Mira had 47 cases on the table, and a charter, and the authority she'd been earning for a decade. And Kaelior Vane, the Alpha King of the Ashwood Territories, the man who had asked who did this to you with the voice of someone who had already decided the answer would change everything, was sitting beside me with his hand in mine, listening to the beginning of the work. And I was here, visible, present, refusing to disappear. That was enough to start. Later on the eastern balcony as the sun set over territories that were already, quietly beginning to become something different, Kaelior stood behind me with his arms around me and his lips against my hair, and neither of us spoke for a long time. Below us, in the courtyard that had been washed clean of blood, I could see 3 of the Omega petitioners helping with the evening meal preparations, not being directed to it, not assigned to it, but choosing it, moving through the space with the tentative, careful quality of people who are not yet sure they're allowed to simply exist somewhere without bracing for correction. They would learn, given time, given safety, given the specific radical experience of being in a place where their presence was not only tolerated, but acknowledged. They would learn. "What are you thinking?" Kaelior asked. "That I used to count survival in minutes," I said. 1 more minute. Then another after that. I paused. "I've stopped counting." His arms tightened. "What are you counting instead?" I thought about the bond, warm and constant in my chest. About Mira's files and the 47 names in them. About 9 petitioners and more coming. About what it felt like to walk into a council chamber and speak and have the words land. About an alpha who had asked the right question in the right dark forest at the exact right moment. "Beginnings," I said. "I'm counting beginnings." He pressed a kiss to my temple, and through the bond I felt everything he couldn't fit into words. The love, the certainty, the absolute conviction that we were exactly where we were supposed to be, having survived everything required to get here. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. What?" "A messenger arrived an hour ago. From the southern wilds." His voice was careful, not alarmed but carrying the specific quality of information that requires processing space. "The 3 Omegas who arrived 2 days ago. They're not just petitioners. They were sent ahead, deliberately. They carry word from a coalition, 7 packs wide, that has been organizing in silence for years." I went still. "They've been waiting," he continued, "for what happened here this week. For proof that what they've been building toward was possible." His arms were solid and present around me. They want to formalize an alliance with us. The sun finished setting. The territories went dark. Somewhere out in the Ashwood, in 7 packs across the southern border, something had been waiting for this moment as long as Mira had been waiting. As long as I had been surviving. As long as all of it had been building toward a point that none of us had been able to see clearly until we were suddenly, irrevocably in the middle of it. How large? I asked. Large enough, he said, to change everything. I looked out over the darkened territories and felt the bond pulse warm and certain in my chest and thought, we were never invisible. Not a single one of us. We were simply waiting for a world strong enough to survive what we'd become when we finally refused to disappear. That world was here now, and whatever came with the dawn, we were ready. If Reva's journey moved you, if you felt the weight of her invisibility and the fire of her becoming, stay close. The Southern Alliance is coming. The claiming moon is 3 days away, and the secrets buried in the Iron Veil Pack's history are about to surface and change everything Reva thought she knew about herself. Subscribe, leave a comment. Tell me, which moment made you stop breathing? Because you were never invisible either. You were just waiting to be seen.